Thank you. You've obviously had an intense afternoon where you've been thinking about all the things that you should be in your industry, and I'm sort of throwing in a curveball at the end, which is, you know, we know about the sustainability development goals. We know about them being concerned with planet, but they're also concerned about people. And the people side of what we're doing in the sustainability arena is something that I just wanted to share with you from my experience and the experience of working with large corporates like Sony, Coca-Cola in the past, now Clifford Chance, EY, Bain, a whole plethora of these organizations. What are they doing about people and sustainability? To say something about myself, I've spent my whole life in the voluntary or third sector, so I'm not from a business background. And when I talk as if I were brought up from day one in the social sector, that's because I was. My father was a Baptist minister and my mum a teacher. And we came to be called to a church in Kingston upon Thames in the 1960s when I was 6 years old. And we turned up at this church, and it was a very large Victorian church, which was falling down really. And there were 25 elderly people in the congregation. And I remember my father sort of saying to them, rousing them and saying, you know, the challenge for all of us is to stop looking in at the needs of our own community and start to look outside to the needs of the outside community. And even as a 6-year-old, I felt a little bit sorry for these elderly people, because Kingston upon Thames, if you've ever been there, it's a large shopping centre, and the church was now sort of isolated on a very busy one-way road system around that town. So who were the community? Who is this community around that place? And they took the challenge and they began to look at what was happening in a town like Kingston upon Thames in the 60s. And some of us have rose-tinted spectacle views of what it was like in those days. We think of the hippies and Flower Power and the Rolling Stones playing and so on. But those of you with slightly longer memories will also know that there were skinheads and road rats and Hells Angels, and the pubs, if you remember, instead of nightclubs, all closed at 11 p.m. on a Friday night. And so all those warring groups who didn't get on and met in their separate pubs would congregate, not so happily, around the railway station, and there were lots of fights and conflicts. And this little church group said, we will open our facilities for these young people after the pubs had closed. And we're going to have a cappuccino machine, which was very radical in those days. And we're going to have orange juice, fresh pressed orange juice, and people will come and sit and, you know, they'll get on and that'll be all fine. What they did was transfer all the conflict and the fights from the railway station to the church premises at first. But in the midst of that, they got to know these young people. And of course, drug taking was something that was very prevalent. And for the vast majority, I have to tell you, it wasn't such a big problem. But for some, it became a matter of life or death, and there weren't really many services available for those young people. So this church community, really, to cut a very long story short, took on this challenge and grew from just providing a little social club to treating 350 heroin dependents on methadone on a daily basis, and became one of the largest drug treatment centres in the UK, and it's still going to this day, called Kaleidoscope. So I was brought up in that environment. I went to university, studied to be a minister myself, came out after training, a bit like I hoped a thinner version of the Vicar of Dibley, waiting to be called to all these churches. But it was in the winter of discontent and nobody wanted to employ somebody like me. So I went back to work with my dad because he had a vacancy for a year. And I stayed there for 15 years. And eventually I took over from him and started to run the place myself. And we faced all kinds of problems related to running an organisation. And he was the original social entrepreneur. So problems were just things that came along and you tried to solve them. And I remember one day we were standing in the courtyard together and we're watching the planes go overhead. And we were thinking about the problem we had with running a residential unit for young people with problems. We had 23 beds and we had to have staff on duty 24 hours a day. Any of you know that residential social work, as it was, young people living on the premises, the burnout rate is very, very high. So people don't usually last more than 2 years in that kind of work. And we were just saying what a burden it is to keep, training these people up, then they last for 2 years, they get burned out and off they go. And my dad said, these people, British Airways, they've probably worked out how to deal with antisocial hours and flying around the globe and doing things in a different way. Why don't we ask them how they've managed it? So he phoned British Airways up, which is very typical of a social entrepreneur. And they were so surprised we weren't asking for money that they were willing to see us. And they talked about their 4-day break system every 15 days, so that people need 4 days for the body clock to really reset itself, rather than what we were doing, which is sort of 1 day and then 2 days after 3 weeks and so on. We implemented this and it solved the problem overnight. And there is one person today at Kaleidoscope who's worked there for 27 years. So I learned early on 2 things. The first is that the business world, the business sector, has lots of answers to some of the problems that we're all dealing with. And the worst that they can say when you ask for help or support is no, and that doesn't kill you. So in my world, we began to look at what the corporate world could do for us. It hadn't occurred to me when I started this new piece of work that I'm doing that we had something to offer them. So 8 years ago, I started a charity called the Social Business Trust, which is what I'm chief executive of now. And I'm passionate about social enterprises. There are thousands. Some people say there are 70,000 in the UK at the moment. Most of them are quite small, below 1 million turnover. And they tackle all issues. One that I'm totally in love with is one called Bikeworks, based in Bethnal Green. These are people who are passionate about cycling and the environment. But they also recognised a lot of people didn't have jobs in Bethnal Green. So they thought they would use the vehicle of the bike and teach unemployed young people who really were finding it difficult and struggling how to make a bike within a few weeks. And this training meant that when they'd finished their training, they would go and work for Halfords or Evans, or Boris Bikes then came along, or Barclays Bikes as it was originally. And they also started to sell second-hand parts of bikes because they were passionate about not having all this biking stuff, equipment going into landfill. That's like a perfect social enterprise. But the problem is they seem to get to about £1 million turnover and then they stay there, sometimes for 25 years. So it's great if you live in Bethnal Green, but what if you live in Sidcup or in Birkenhead in Liverpool? You don't have access to that kind of social enterprise. So my passion has been about scaling up social enterprises and helping to make them more sustainable so they can reach many more beneficiaries. And the business community actually likes using their employees to do these pieces of work and interventions and help and support. Why? Because you've been involved, I'm sure, in learning and development programs, and a lot of it is theoretical, and it's a bit dull, and it's not heartwarming, shall we say. It's something that you do. Whereas if you go into a social enterprise and you meet all these incredibly committed, enthusiastic people, it's very entrepreneurial, the culture. It's very fast moving. People are incredibly enthusiastic. And you feel great about doing this piece of work and using your skills in a completely different environment. And even better, sometimes you're thanked. One of the companies we work with is Bain. Like McKinsey, strategy organization, hugely highly paid, very sophisticated people. They go into the big companies and do all this analyzing and so on. But they don't get thanked very much because the big company has paid a huge amount of money for Bain to come in. And usually it's the chief executive who's called them in. And actually the employees are very suspicious and don't like it at all. So they come in, they do their work, they go, get paid well. But how good do they feel about the work that they're doing all the time? And then we bring into the equation these so-called millennials. I've given birth to 3 of these millennials myself, and I can say that they are as educated, as committed, they are focused. In many, many ways, they're exactly the same as you and I were, except that because of the internet revolution, which I'm very pro, I have to say, the downside of it was for children of 19, 20, 21, the ones that I know very well, the mental health of that group is quite fragile, as we know, because of the kind of 24/7, totally, out there information that they're sharing about themselves, their image, and so on. So when they come into the workplace, they actually are saying to their employers, we don't just want a day off a year to do some voluntary work or 3 days a year. We want you, the employer, to find us the opportunities, the things that we could do that will make us feel that we're more connected to our communities. We're probably not going to work for one company for the whole of our lives. So we expect, when we're looking at different organizations to work for, one of the differentiating factors may be, what is your social responsibility? What programs are you going to offer? And we find at the Social Business Trust that many more companies are using what they're doing in the social sector to be an added attraction to some of these graduates who are going to be working with them. There are hundreds of stories that I could tell you about the impact that the businesses are able to have on the social enterprises, but one really tickles me enormously, which is that we have a social enterprise called the Shakespeare Schools Foundation. They love Shakespeare. And they think that the only way to enjoy and fall in love with Shakespeare is to perform it, and that what often happens in school is quite dry and puts people off. Furthermore, the people who put their hand up to volunteer to take part in a Shakespearean play are often the people who are very pro-drama, very confident, and they always get the big parts, and that's fine. So the Shakespeare Schools Foundation was created to bring Shakespearean plays into the classroom for everybody. And what they do is they've truncated those classics like Hamlet, Julius Caesar, to a 30-minute production. They go into the local theatre, professional theatre, and they mix the kids together from special needs schools, from great schools, private schools, bad state schools, good state schools. They mix them all together and they put on these performances which are amazing. And they particularly pick on kids who don't put their hand up to volunteer and who find perhaps speaking in public a bit of an ordeal. And the transformation with those kids is amazing. Now, how can a corporate help that organisation? Well, one of the things that's happened recently is that the government have said in the guise of the HMRC that they are going to allow theatre companies to have a discount, if you like, because they are theatres, but you have to apply for this. And any of you who've ever applied for HMRC monies or grant or this particular kind of thing will know it's fearsome and difficult and convoluted and bureaucratic. So this small organisation, which is about 1.5, 1.7 million turnover, couldn't do it. And in EY, we found there's a little tax department. They sit there, they do this work all day, every day. Some of them are young, some of them are old. And we asked them, could they do this for this organisation? They got together and said, no, we do these kind of things all the time, and they did it. And a couple of months ago, Shakespeare Schools Foundation got a cheque to reimburse them for £110,000. And every year from now on, they will get an extra £100,000 back. And that little team who do this work for big corporations and small, when the chief executive, Ruth Brock, who's an amazing, charismatic person, phoned them screaming down the phone that she got this cheque for £110,000, how good did they feel? Fantastic. Sometimes when we're working with the social enterprises, we don't realise how intertwined we are within our communities and how we can learn lessons about what you've been discussing today, where you're going to go strategically, what you're going to do yourselves, in these simple encounters with other organisations from completely different planets. One of ours is Hartfordshire Independent Living Services, and they run Meals on Wheels with a bit of a difference. And they really believe that because they're going in to see the elderly person every single day, that they're the best person to alert the GP, the family, neighbours if there's something going wrong. So it's an amazing thing to bring it back into the community, because Meals on Wheels have practically ceased altogether. But the Mayor of London thought this would be fantastic in London, but he said you can't possibly use these vehicles that you're using at the moment because they're in a rural community and they use these vans and off they go. And we can't have that, so you're going to have electric vehicles. And they were like, oh my God, you know, we don't know anything about that. And then somebody said, well, maybe we could use Deliveroo or we could do it in a different way. And you find then that the business people sitting down, we're all scratching our heads at how can we help Meals on Wheels be delivered in a more sustainable way in a city environment from a rural environment. And you wouldn't have thought that just by volunteering your skills within that organisation, you would make such a difference. So going back to when I was young, and there was this challenge to that little church community, which was saying, stop looking in at your own problems and start seeing that the solutions to some of those are when you look outside of yourself into your local community. So when you're thinking about sustainability, think about your people. Think about the ways you develop them. Think about the communities that all of them come from every day when they come to work and go back home to. Think of their families in schools. Think of their families working in shops, working all over the place, not just the person in front of you. And think about the millennials in terms of how can we help them to be the fulfilled, happy, stable people that they can be. How do we make our organisations sustainable for the people that we encounter? Thank you very much.